After all these decades of fieldwork, supported by the British School and the Emeritus in Thebes, and covering the territories and urban centres of a number of Boeotian polis, I feel that the most interesting of them all is Thespiai. This is partly because of its remarkable classical history, remarkable yet widely overlooked. As a sign of that, ask yourself how many times, whether in childhood, from teachers, or above all from the cinema and other media, you've been told about the heroic stand of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae in 480. Compare this with how often you've heard the story of the 700 Thespians who died with them, likewise to a man, a much greater sacrifice both absolutely and especially relatively for a much smaller city. Their story is all there in Book 7 of Herodotus, who even knows the names of the dead Thespian commander and of the Thespian who was held to have fought and died most bravely. This imbalance has recently begun to attract attention, at least in the modern village of Thespiés, which lies just above the ancient site. A few years ago, one of its richer citizens, not content with having a village high street long named as the Road of the 700, paid for this statue to be set up, with an unusually long inscription making clear that the motive for its erection was not just pride, but also resentment of the disproportionate attention paid to the Spartan role at Thermopylae. But in antiquity, Thermopylae did evidently help to establish a Thespian reputation for doughty hoplite fighting. We hear of it from Thucydides at the triumphant victory over the Athenians at Delion in 424, then again from Xenophon at the less glorious reverse of the Boeotians and their allies at the Nemea River in 394 BC. But it's not only classical history that is interesting about Thespiae. There's its prehistory too. There can't be many classical sites with a ploughed field right in the middle where you are as likely to pick up painted Neolithic sherds as classical ones. This early prominence was scarcely maintained through the Bronze Age, as we shall see. Then there's also the rather curious post-antique history of the site, which involved a change of name that in turn led to well over a century, from the later 17th to the beginning of the 19th century, during which the location and identification of the site of Thespiae were delayed by debate and controversy. But next, let's look at the broader picture of Boeotia as a whole. As one looks at this satellite image of central Greece, with Attica under a cloud and Boeotia and Euboea in clear sunshine, several metaphors come to mind. My own choice would point to the relative openness of Boeotia and indeed Euboea for breaking new ground in original research, compared with the gigantic existing database that relates to every aspect of Athens and Attica. Boeotia as a region is in fact of closely comparable size and, at times anyway, of population to Attica. But there were and are big contrasts too, not least in respect of the fertility of the landscape, such a boon to survey practice. Here we are looking at a map from a 150-year-old classical atlas. The age hardly matters because very little progress has been made in those 150 years with locating the territorial boundaries of Greek city-states, including those in Boeotia. Thespiai's original frontier ran roughly along this green line, and I use the slide to point out two important features. First, the uncomfortably close proximity of its bigger neighbour Thebes, whose evident expansion in the late Bronze Age, by the way, probably had a lot to do with the eclipse of Thespiai mentioned earlier. Secondly, the vital asset enjoyed by Thespiai of access through its harbour of Creusis to the Gulf of Corinth, the gateway not only to the Peloponnese on the other side, bypassing Attica, but also westwards to the Ionian Islands and Italy. Now on to the site of Thespiae itself. This vertical air photo brings out the first obvious point about the location, that today it's entirely covered in densely cultivated farming land, an exceptional feature for a Greek polis site, and one for which they adopted the unusual expedient of having recourse en masse to an external acropolis at a place called Keressos. This choice of city location nevertheless baffled the early Western travellers, along with a second feature, the polygonal shape right in the centre of the picture and outlined by modern farm tracks. Until 1890, this marked the course of a fortification wall of late antique date, the Castro, which was destroyed in that year by the French epigraphist Paul Jameau, who had detected the presence of several partly visible inscribed stones built into the wall. This rather brutal tactic was successful insofar as he brought to light well over 200 texts of Greco-Roman date, but Jameau did also excavate structures inside the Castro, which come close to proving that inside it there had also lain the much earlier civic centres in the shape of the Greek agora and the Roman forum. But the small extent of the Castro, enclosing a mere 12 hectares, had earlier been found puzzling, as I said. This was much too small for a major city, and the chronological determinations which explain it were not yet available in 1800. Also visible at the top of the image are the twin modern villages of Thespiés and Leondari, in fact located on much higher ground looking down on the plain. And just below Thespiés you may be able to make out the partly natural hollow into which the probably Hellenistic Greek theatre was inserted, to be singled out by the travel writer Pausanias as a site well worth a visit. Away to the east of the city, the ancient city, lies the Polyandrion, the military cemetery where, among others, the heroes of Delion in 424 BC were buried, the location of the only really important excavation at ancient Thespiae, begun by that perennially underrated archaeologist Panayotis Stamatakis. A closer look from a lower level oblique air photo, looking from the east this time, brings out the agricultural use of the terrain, with scarcely a square metre left uncultivated. This landscape would be an excavator's nightmare, where even to begin digging, but a surveyor's dream, with access to almost 100% of the ground. With the outline of the Castro again clearly visible, note also another important feature, the low hillock, crowned by a modern building, which forms the magula of the Neolithic site, with the ploughed field to the right, which I referred to in the prelude. But the activities of Paul Jameau, in addition to transforming the face of the site physically, have in fact ensured that Thespiae remains a far more prominent site for epigraphy than for archaeology. Inscriptions continue to come to light, such as this one, found by our own project in 2007. This 4th century BC stone contains the first record in Boeotia of the Pentecostologoi, an institution most likely copied from Athens, with whom Thespiai was at times allied. These were a group of tax farmers responsible for collecting a levy of 1/50th, i.e. 2%, on all the city's imports and exports. We've already seen how important was Thespiai's access to the Corinthian Gulf, and most likely this substantiates it. But for the next stage, I hand over to John.
The Boeotia Regional Survey Project is primarily focused on intensive field-by-field surface field walking, documenting surface ceramics and architecture, supported by geophysics and geochemistry. On the right, we can see the 5 city-states and landscape areas we have studied since 1979. Today we should look at Thespiai city and its hinterland in the center of the image. On the left, we see the rural areas field walked from 1979 onwards between the 2 ancient cities of Haliartos at the top and Thespiai below. In 1984, we decided to tackle these 2 urban sites by total surface collection. The best model we found was the exemplary surface survey of the giant pre-Columban city of Teotihuacan in Mexico by Millon and Whalen in the 1960s, using a formal grid. Here is our first application to Haliartos with the collected surface ceramics. We turned in 1985 to 6 to a larger, more difficult city, Thespiai, lying in the lowland, between the modern hill villages of Thespiés and Leondari. As Anthony has told you, the sole locational clue was our rediscovery of the late Roman fort or castro, circled here. Our survey eventually covered almost 2 square kilometers in and around the castro, using a nested grid of large and small recording units. The ceramic survey was accompanied by architectural, geophysical, and geochemical surveys. Analyzing the pottery densities led to a proposal that the maximum occupation zone was defined by a figure of 22,000 sherds per hectare. The occupational history of the city site was based on over 14,000 sherds, 80% datable. Time runs clockwise here. It soon became obvious that mingled surface finds from the Neolithic to the 19th century AD made interpretation very complex, especially as the representation of periods was extremely variable, as again you see from this pie chart. A first step was to identify a broad spatial structure across the site. 10 sectors were chosen to highlight period concentrations. The Roman was concentrated in the central Castro area, the Agora Forum location, while the Greek classical was dominant in the remaining city zones. In the Far East, a clear medieval settlement was recognized, and prehistoric sherds had a high focus on the small Bagula hill in the east center. Prehistoric finds were badly affected by sample size, as shown here, when we correlate the numbers collected in each grid unit, in red with the scale on the left, with prehistoric finds, in blue, with the scale on the right. Grid collection samples smaller than 30 sherds were unlikely to detect prehistoric pottery. So apart from the main Magula settlement, they were underrepresented. Another important statistical exercise compared the period maps from the large and small collection units, as for example here for the Archaic era, where there is poor agreement. We ranked the periods by the number of dated sherds, shown here, and discovered that we probably need some 600 sherds per phase to produce a definitive map of settlement across the town site. From methodology, let us now view our reconstruction of the development of human settlement across the city sites. In many respects, it offers a microcosm of major trends in the long-term evolution of society in southern mainland Greece. For some 2,000 years, Neolithic early farming life was confined to the Magula hillock. Here we see our prehistoric specialist Popisari on the left, showing the site to Catherine Perlez. And here, typical Neolithic ceramics from the collection. With hoe farming, the key resource on which the Tel population was focused was the moist valley of the Cannavaris stream. In final Neolithic and early Bronze Age times, an explosion of artifacts appears across the site. We expect that this pattern is created by the colonization by small shifting farms and farm clusters around the landscape, stimulated by changes in farming technology, the secondary products revolution, a new emphasis on the secondary products of domestic animals such as dairy and wool, and the spread of the Ard plough. The Magula remains a small hamlet focus for these short-lived farms. With the Middle Bronze Age, population is more confined, perhaps to 2 or 3 farm clusters, surely still less than 200 people. In Mycenaean times, little changes. Any development at the site being limited by the presence nearby to the east of the extensive site of Eutresis, a secondary centre to the palace at Thebes. Like other cities we have surveyed, Tanagra and Koronia, despite their and Thespiai's mention in the Iliad's catalogue of ships, a city at Thespiai only emerges at the end of the early Iron Age, perhaps adding to the case that this part of Homer's Iliad dates from the Archaic era. Pottery is still poorly known and often coarse, so the representation is weak. We suspect a series of hamlets with their own cemeteries scattered over the site. But by Archaic times, as we see here, we reconstruct a town of some 40 hectares with a ring of cemeteries and maybe 5,000 inhabitants. The climax of this city is the classical to mid-Hellenistic, the 5th to the 3rd centuries BC, when we estimate 72 hectares and about 9,000 inhabitants. However, we must deconstruct this sherd map to suggest the urban infrastructure based on ceramics, architecture, and rare archaeological sections. We owe to our colleague Božidar Slapšák, who I'm glad is listening in, and shown on the right, the discovery of many key urban features, such as the theatre hollow, shown on the left, with several surviving theatre seats. Here is our proposed classical city plan. And as we reach the classical Florescence, I want to hand back to Anthony to talk about the classical high point.
Now, resuming, I'd like to highlight 1 or 2 of our discoveries that have thrown up historical problems. First, the raw accounts of the often loosely dated potsherds from the urban site needed a lot of filtering to display the minority that could be dated in terms of calendar centuries BC. They then look like this. Immediately obvious is the upward leap from the later 6th century, quotes archaic to classical, to the 5th, the losses at Thermopylae notwithstanding. Then, throughout the classical period and into the early Hellenistic, a similarly high level of pottery deposition, and thus probably of population, persists. It won't be until about 150 BC that this markedly falls off. So far, so good. This is exactly what we would expect from the historical sources for Boeotia. But there is this difficulty for the Thespians in the 4th century, because after choosing the wrong side in the climactic showdown between Sparta and Thebes, to the point of accepting a Spartan garrison based in Thespiae for the preceding 7 years, the Spartan disaster at Leuctra in 371 left them an almost absurdly exposed situation. They did what they'd done at least once before, fleeing to their external acropolis at Keressos. There's no time to say more on the location of Keressos than that our latest discoveries after a forest fire in 2007 on the hill of Pyrgaki above Astra provide strong grounds for placing Keressos there, 10 kilometers away to the west of Thespiae. That was not enough to deter Epaminondas of Thebes, who promptly captured Keressos and punished the Thespians, if with a lesser degree of severity than they might have feared. But their old fortification walls were undoubtedly levelled, and political subordination to Thebes in some form persisted for the next 30 years. Yet how far were the penalties otherwise inflicted on them severe? Here are the claims of Athenian orators, first Isocrates in the 350s, then Demosthenes more persistently in the 350s and even the 340s, alleged that Thespiae had been reduced to a desert, not just unfortified but even uninhabited, and remained in this state despite an unfulfilled promise from Philip of Macedon to restore it. This seems very hard to reconcile with that histogram, where the yellow column suggests that Thespiae, like Boeotia as a whole, achieved its absolute demographic peak in this 4th century. Philip was, of course, a prime target for Athenian rhetoric, right down to his later triumph at Chaeronea. And I would like to suggest that because of the conditions of ancient travel, politicians like Isocrates and Demosthenes would never actually have found time to make the journey of nearly 100 kilometers to see for themselves, relying on hearsay instead. It is notable that in the pages of the contemporary historians Xenophon, who'd had first-hand experience of some of the main events, and of Ephoros, insofar as we know of his account at second hand through Diodorus, there is little or nothing said about this extended retribution for Thespiae. Yet well before this, in the 5th century, Thespiae had, as we saw, achieved striking growth. This is reflected most clearly of all in the fact that for a time she had acquired political control over 3 smaller neighbours, Little Siphae and Chorsiae, and the much more substantial Thespiae. This explains how, in the constitution of the Boeotian League described by the so-called Oxyrhynchos historian, essentially of the second half of the 5th century, the Thespian contribution to the armed forces of the Boeotian League implies a free population then amounting to as many as about 20,000 people. It also meant that Thespiae had exclusive control over Boeotian access to the Corinthian Gulf. As you can see, if you follow round all the way the dashed line of the Boeotian frontier on the Gulf, and see that it coincides with the current boundary of Thespian territory. This state of affairs probably persisted for most of the era between the Persian Wars, with the consequent eclipse of Thebes after 480, and the King's Peace of 386 BC. I use the next slide simply to illustrate one of the things that survey can do by using an identical scale of find density per hectare for both rural and urban terrain, the steady gradation from farmland to city centre, where it can rise well into double figures of sherds per square metre, is displayed. But note that the rural landscape is by no means empty of settlement. These small rural sites, which generate little local peaks of density, were in our view inhabited farmsteads, not, as others have argued, mere locations for animal shelter and product storage. As well as producing copious roofing tiles, fine tablewares, coarse storage pottery, they yield spinning equipment, implying the presence of women as well as men, and even lamps. As I once commented, goats don't read at night. I should finally say something about warfare, which for Thespiai, as for so many other Greek polis, implies fortification. Thucydides tells us that at a moment of weakness after the heavy Thespian losses in the victory of Delion, the Thebans unscrupulously took the opportunity to level the city walls of Thespiai in 423, quote, having long wished to do so, close quotes. So the Thespians must have fortified their city sometime in the aftermath of Thermopylae from 480 onwards. Next, Xenophon says that King Agesilaus of Sparta, on garrisoning Thespiae with Spartans in the early 370s BC, as a first step rebuilt those destroyed walls, presumably on the same lines as 45 years before. But they were not to survive long, as in the aftermath of Leuctra, the Thespians, as we saw, preferred to flee to Keressos rather than try to defend their city. And Epaminondas will undoubtedly have destroyed any surviving remnants of these walls afterwards. Given the obliteration of ancient remains on the city site, it's hardly surprising that we have struggled to trace the line of this 5th century wall, beyond a couple of stretches north of the Castro, where it seems to be visible in the break of slope with embedded blocks in it. That's why the rest of it is shown here as a schematic rectangle in blue. What we did discover, quite unexpectedly, was a fortification running in completely the wrong direction, northwards, away from the city centre, up the steep hillside to enclose part of the area now occupied by the modern village of Thespiés, then returning southwards to rejoin the older wall line. That later wall is shown here in red, and such pottery as was associated with it was of Hellenistic date. Anyway, it's obvious enough that building this extension only made sense with the continued existence or revival of the older wall shown in blue. There is yet another installment in the tale from the Mithridatic Wars, when Archelaus, the general of Mithridates, invaded mainland Greece with a large army in 88 to 87 BC, marched on Thespiai, which alone of the Boeotian cities had sworn to uphold its alliance with Rome, and besieged it. It must have been this Hellenistic fortification which the Thespians now defended, and remarkably their defence must have been successful, since they afterwards erected a statue in honour of the Roman legatus Quintus Bratius Sura for coming down from Thessaly and rescuing them in time. Thus we see yet again illustration of Thespian bellicosity, with the difference that by this time they had finally learned how to choose a winning side. Slide. The last chapter in the long story of Thespian military architecture is, of course, provided by the Castro, which, in this view looking down from the modern village, is seen here circled in red. Paul Jameau did not even get to publish most of the inscriptions that he'd retrieved when destroying the wall, leaving it to his more conscientious successors, who luckily recorded their exact find spots. The latest of the datable inscriptions from the wall structure belongs around AD 369, so the building of the Castro must have been later than that, perhaps even during the reign of the Emperor Justinian, who is recorded as having refortified a number of cities in central Greece in the earlier 6th century of the Christian era. But now back to John again.
Picking up from where Anthony was just talking about fortifications, arguably in the late 4th century BC, there was this large extension to the city walls in red to include the adjacent high ground, where the modern village of Thespiae lies. But from our survey, this extension to the city was very little occupied. So it was a planned urban extension which really didn't work out. It was Božidar Slapšák again who traced this new fortification, which included a surviving mud brick section. We suspect this urban extension was an optimistic reaction to the destruction of that hostile neighboring city of Thebes in 335 BC, which also we have noticed there are other reactions in other cities that we studied. The climax of the classical city was matched, as we see here, by a full countryside of farms and hamlets. These lie, however, as islands amidst a sea of dense off-site ceramics. The explanation was found long ago by Tony Wilkinson. This is his diagram of agricultural manuring radii from ancient and medieval settlements in the Near East. And you can look at the scale below for cities moving up to some kilometers out. Wilkinson argued that intense landscape manuring was a symptom of rare periods of human overpopulation. So Boeotian sherd carpets mark intensive manuring out of classical cities, affecting the land only immediately near the city, using massive city rubbish to do so, spread on the fields by urban-dwelling farmers commuting daily to their fields. Off-site ceramic carpets, here you see the chronology, in central Greece are almost entirely dating from one era, the classical Greek. This was when the city and countryside were at their maximum population, and food production was at risk without intensive manuring. In the late Hellenistic era, after about 150 BC, and into early Roman imperial times, Boeotian cities mostly contract in size, while their landscapes can see a dramatic reduction in activity. Thespiae is a case we have so far studied in most detail. The city shrinks from 72 to 34 hectares, about 4,250 inhabitants. This contraction occurred already in late Hellenistic times, the last 150 years BC. The city remains small in early and late Roman times, with burials infringing on the former urban space. The Boeotian countryside sees serious desertion as the towns shrink or die. Here is the evidence from the inner Chora of Thespiae. The off-site ceramics, shown here in sequence, from Greek through early then late Roman, show the disappearance of landscape manuring, except around rural sites, as the city population collapses. We believe that the Hellenistic cities of Boeotia were overpopulated, and their agriculture was ecologically unsustainable. The levels of population were only to be reached again in Boeotia after the 1960s. Demographic decline by late Hellenistic times was then inevitable. The Roman impact was negative in twofold ways. Firstly, cities were destroyed or subject to punishing fines. More insidious was the arrival of Italian financial agents, negotiatores, liberty, increasing the globalization and the capitalization of town and country. Negotiatores are very busy at Thespiai. Moreover, throughout Greece, towns shrink and disappear by early Roman times, as our recent ERC project in Leiden has shown, and I show you the part relating to Greece by my colleague Michalis Karambinis, and these images come from his paper in 2018 from a Journal of Greek Archaeology. On the left, the classical urban city numbers and sizes are contrasted on the right to those of the early Roman Empire. Although the city remains small, there is a gradual recolonization of the countryside. Rural recovery develops after 200 AD and culminates in the 5th to 6th centuries AD, focused on commercial villa estates. The ancient geographer Strabo notes that while the early Roman cities of Boeotia are in a poor state, Thespiae is unusual as being at least moderately prosperous. Philip Bess has shown the low level of ceramic imports to the Roman city, you see here, with regional products forming 75% of tableware. In late antiquity, about 400 to 600 AD, the city remained small, about 30 hectares, perhaps less than 4,000 inhabitants, focused on a fortified castro. The two early Christian churches in the cemetery areas to the northeast and the east will play a major role after antiquity. The densest late antique occupation lies in the castro, long the core of city life as the agora forum sector. Geochemical tests across the castro wall from the countryside show a dramatic increase in soil pollution due to what is called the habitation effect in lead, zinc, and copper. After Rome, the Byzantine era, the 7th to the 12th centuries AD. In the early Byzantine period, the 7th to 9th centuries AD, human presence in the former city is very scanty, but widespread, although pottery datable to this time span is poorly known. We suspect a series of hamlet farms, although a capital from the Castro, shown left, suggests a church in the 8th century. Surely less than 200 people lived here now. The entire medieval era is represented in our wider survey area by the city village and a hamlet to its south. With the revival of the Middle Byzantine Empire from the 10th century onward, our local community blossoms into two close villages, each located by a Byzantine church. Both have early Christian foundations as former cemetery churches, as we highlighted earlier. We suggest about 300 inhabitants. With the conquest of Greece by the Western Frankish armies of the Fourth Crusade in the early 13th century, our villages flourish even more. An enhanced agricultural production for a new feudal lord is shown by infield manuring. Maybe now 600 occupants in total. Just who was the feudal lord of our two villages? Remarkably, a papal letter of 1210 informs us that the settlement of Erimocastro, appropriately of the deserted Castro, was awarded to the Latin order of Premonstratensian monks. Elsewhere in Boeotia, we have recorded feudal towers dominating their Greek villages, as published by Peter Locke in the ABSA. And Peter told us to look for a monumental feudal building at Erimocastro. Ojeda Slapshak revealed this for us by clearing the accumulated rubbish from the eastern village church. A large early Christian basilica above, shown in green, was replaced by a smaller Middle Byzantine village church below in red. But in Frankish times, a tower, shown in grey and in the photo, was constructed adjacent to the village church, surely the defended office and storehouse of the monks. Ottoman Boeotia, the 15th to the early 19th centuries. The late 14th century was a time of unremitting disaster for mainland populations. The Black Death, climate deterioration, and warfare between Franks, Byzantines, and the expanding Ottoman Turks, causing massive depopulation. By the mid-15th century, the incoming Ottoman Empire faithfully records a radical transformation in rural settlement in Boeotia, in its detailed tax records, studied for us by Makil Keel. A diminished Greek population in 2 towns and mostly large refuge villages are shown in black circles. The largely abandoned countryside has been recolonized following Ottoman encouragement by exotic Albanian settlers. See the numerous small white squares. Our Erimocastro villages have become deserted, for the Greek refuge village of Panaia indicated, also published in the ABSA. But as usual, the Ottomans have directed an Albanian clan to occupy a nearby niche, the new village of Zogra Kobili, the ancestor of the modern Leandari village above the city site. 100 years later, and the Pax Ottomanica has stimulated a general revival of population in both the Greek and the Albanian villages. However, from the 17th century onwards, the Ottoman Empire enters a progressive decline. The ocean population plummets due to political, economic, climatic, and military pressures. The larger villages are broken up into smaller serf estates or chifliks. One consequence is that our Erimocastro population returns from Panaia to their former homes. And here is their tax record for 1646. Resettling both the old village sites, as our survey shows. But they also settle an adjacent hilltop, next to the continuing Albanian Zogra Kobili village, to found modern Thespiae village. And we can see both hilltop settlements in this atmospheric photo of 1890. Leandari Zogra Kobili in the distance and Erimocastro Thespiae in the foreground, with this wonderful picture of this young couple in traditional dress. The 4 settlements in the plain and hilltops still amount to less than 300 people. In the early 19th century, the city-state villages are abandoned, leaving these 2 hilltop villages to survive into the present day. It was exciting for us to trace our settlement history from the Neolithic to the origins of our present communities, and we were drawn to look closer at these early modern villages. Here, Erimocastro Thespiae on its hill, revealed in its core, shown on the right, stone-based houses dating back to the 18th century. To the late 19th century, almost all Boeotian villages shared these longhouse dwellings, macrinaria, with their domestic animals. We have also conducted village studies pro-social anthropologists. By the end of the 19th century, at the end of our sequence, as we've shown here, now at the bottom, our two hilltop villages have risen to 1,200 inhabitants, and scholars had revealed that Erimokastro was the likely descendant of ancient Thespiae below. Thus it was renamed as Thespiés. Its hilltop neighbor Zograkobeli, also known as Kaskaveli, also sought an ancient Greek name, using the discovery of an ancient stone lion from its territory, from the Delion battle cemetery, the Polyandrion, hence became Leondari. For Thespiae, as Anthony pointed out at the beginning of his talk, this rediscovery has prompted a new pride in its forgotten glorious ancient past. A local businessman has sponsored a monument to the 700 Thespians who died at Thermopylae, and some claim that it's his face which is sculptured in this image, inscribing this: "Still verbal history continues for 25 centuries to present the Spartans only. This is offensive for me, and I feel the duty to castigate this injustice. It's as if Thermopylae was only a Spartan issue." More intriguing is the parallel desire in the villagers of Leondari to uncover and take pride in their very different origin, to find their own place in history, as my encounter with this gentleman in the supermarket revealed. For the full story of our work at ancient Thespiae and its countryside, see our two published volumes shown here. Many thanks for your participation in this lecture from Anthony and myself.